Welcome back to another NFL weekly recap in which we are going to recap all 15 games from week 7. The two teams that were on bye this week were the Chicago Bears and the Dallas Cowboys. If you like this type of content, like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and I appreciate all the support as we are trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. So let's get straight into this one and start it off with Thursday night football between the Denver Broncos and the New Orleans Saints. The Denver Broncos beat the Saints 33-10 as they head into week 8 with a 4-3 record. The Saints fall to 2-5. Bo Nix went 16 for 26 for 164 yards, and Javonte Williams led the team in rushing with 88 yards and 2 touchdowns. Troy Franklin led the team in receiving with 50 yards, and Spencer Rattler started for the injured Derek Carr and had 172 yards on the play, and Jake Haener played for one drive as he scored a touchdown and had 38 yards. Kendre Miller led the team in rushing with 36 yards, and Cedric Wilson Jr. led the team in receiving with a touchdown. Denver scored the first 13 points of the game and took a 16-3 lead heading into halftime, and then they scored the first 10 points of the second half to take a 26-3 lead. It wasn't until the fourth quarter that the Denver's defense scored a fumble touchdown, and the Saints scored a touchdown of their own on their final drive, which gave us the final results of 33-10 in favor of the Broncos. Next game of the week was Saquon Barkley's homecoming game against his former team, the New York Giants. The Eagles beat the Giants 28-3, and the Eagles head into week 8 with a 4-2 record, while the Giants fall to 2-5. Jalen Hurts went 10 for 14 with 114 yards and a touchdown. Saquon Barkley went off with 176 yards and a touchdown on the day, while Jalen Hurts scored 2 rushing touchdowns as well. A.J. Brown led the team in receiving with 89 yards and 1 touchdown, while Daniel Jones went 14 for 21 with 99 yards on the play. Tyrone Tracy led the team in rushing with 23 yards, and Malik Neighbors led the team in receiving with 41 yards on the day. The Eagles scored the first 14 points of the game and took a 14-3 lead heading into halftime, and then the Eagles scored 2 more touchdowns to give us the final score of 28-3, with the Eagles victorious. Next game of the week was between the Las Vegas Raiders and the Los Angeles Rams, in which the Rams beat the Raiders 20-15. The Raiders head into week 8 with a 2-5 records, while the Rams have a 2-4 record. Gardner Minshew went 15 for 34 with 154 yards and 3 interceptions as he was benched for Aiden O'Connell in the game. Alexander Madison led the team in rushing with 92 yards, and Brock Bowers led the team in receiving with 93 yards on the play. Matthew Stafford went 14 for 23 with 154 yards and an interception. Kyron Williams led the team in rushing with 76 yards and 2 touchdowns, and Tyler Johnson led the team in receiving with 57 yards on the day. Las Vegas scored the first points of the game with a field goal early on in the first quarter, and then the Rams, to close off the second quarter, scored a touchdown with their offense and had a fumble touchdown on the Raiders. The Raiders then scored a field goal on their final drive as the Rams led 14-6 heading into halftime. The Raiders then scored 3 field goals in the second half to give us the final score of 15-20. The Rams were able to hold on. The next game of the week was the London game between the New England Patriots and the Jacksonville Jaguars, in which the Jaguars beat the Patriots 32-16. The Patriots are 1-6, and the Jacksonville Jaguars are 2-5. Drake May went 26 for 37 with 276 yards and 2 touchdowns. Drake May also led the team in rushing with 18 yards on the day. Hunter Henry led the team in receiving with 92 yards, while Jermichael Hasty had 49 yards and a touchdown of his own. Trevor Lawrence went 15 for 20 with 193 yards and a touchdown. Tanks Bigsby led the team in rushing with 118 yards and 2 touchdowns. The rookie out of LSU, Brian Thomas Jr., led the team in receiving with 89 yards and a touchdown on the day. The Patriots scored the first 10 points of the game on their first 2 drives, while the Jaguars then scored the next 22 points as they took a 22-10 lead over the Patriots heading into halftime. In the second half, on the first drive, the Jags scored a field goal to push their lead to 10-25. The Patriots then scored a touchdown to bring it up to 16-25, and on the final drive for the Jaguars on the day, they scored a touchdown to give us the final score of 32-16. The next game of the week was between the Buffalo Bills and the Tennessee Titans. The Buffalo Bills beat the Titans 34-10. The Titans fall to 1-5, while the Bills are 5-2. Mason Rudolph started for the Titans as he went 25 for 40 with 215 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. Tony Pollard led the team in rushing with 61 yards, while Chig Okonkwo led the team in receiving with 50 yards, while Nick Westbrook-Ikine had a touchdown on the day. Josh Allen went 21 for 33 with 323 yards and 2 touchdowns. Ray Davis led the team in rushing with 41 yards, with both him and James Cook having a touchdown rushing. Amari Cooper, after the trade, playing his first game with the Bills, had 66 yards on the day with a touchdown, while rookie out of Florida State, Keon Coleman, led the team in receiving with 125 yards. Ty Johnson also had a touchdown on the day. The Titans scored the first 10 points of the game as they took a 10-7 lead over the Bills heading into halftime. However, once the second half started, the Bills started to pour on the scoring as they pretty much scored on every drive that they had in the second half. This drove up the score as the score ended up with 34-10 in favor of the Bills. The Titans did not score any points in the second half. Next game of the week was between the Green Bay Packers and the Houston Texans, in which the Packers defeated the Texans 24-22. Both teams are 5-2 heading into Week 8. CJ Stroud went 10 for 21, while Joe Mixon led the team in rushing with 115 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. Dalton Schultz led the team in receiving with 28 yards on the day, while Jordan Love went 24 for 33 with 220 yards, 3 touchdowns to 2 interceptions. Josh Jacobs led the team in rushing with 76 yards, while Romeo Doubs led the team in receiving with 94 yards, while Dontavian Wicks, Tucker Kraft, and Josh Jacobs, all 3 had receiving touchdowns on the day. The Texans scored the first points of the game with a field goal, which was answered with a Green Bay touchdown, which was followed up by touchdowns by both teams, and there was lots of scoring in the first half. However, the Texans had a 19-14 lead over the Packers heading into the second half. However, on the first drive of the second half, the Packers scored a touchdown to take a 21-19 lead over the Texans, and both teams scored field goals on their last drive, which just gave the Packers the edge over the Texans as they beat them 24-22. Next game of the week was a divisional matchup in the NFC North between the Minnesota Vikings and the Detroit Lions, in which the Lions defeated the Vikings 31-29, while both teams are 5-1 heading into Week 8. Jared Goff went 22 for 25 with 280 yards and 2 touchdowns. Jahmyr Gibbs led the team in rushing with 116 yards and 2 touchdowns, and Amon-Ra St. Brown led the team in receiving with 112 yards, and both him and Khalif Raymond had a receiving touchdown on the day. Sam Darnold went 22 for 27 with 259 yards, one touchdown to one interception, while Aaron Jones led the team in rushing with 93 yards and a touchdown. Justin Jefferson led the team in receiving with 81 yards and a touchdown. The Vikings scored the first 10 points of the game until the Lions scored two consecutive touchdowns in the second quarter, make it 3 as they took a 21-10 lead over the Vikings heading into halftime. Both teams scored touchdowns on their first drive of the second half, and the Vikings were able to follow it up with two field goals to make it 28-23. And on defense, the Vikings returned a fumble touchdown to give themselves a 29-28 lead until the final drive of the game, in which the kicker was able to send out a victory knockout as the Lions beat the Vikings 31-29. Next game of the week was between the Seattle Seahawks and the Atlanta Falcons, in which the Seahawks beat the Falcons 34-14. Both teams are 4-3 heading into week 8, while Geno Smith went 18 for 28 with 207 yards and two touchdowns, and Jackson Smith-Njigba had a completion for 35 yards on the day. Kenneth Walker led the team in rushing with 69 yards and a touchdown, while DK Metcalf led the team in receiving with 99 yards and a touchdown. Kenneth Walker also had a touchdown receiving. Kirk Cousins went 24 for 35 with 232 yards, one touchdown to two interception, as Michael Penix was able to complete one pass out of one attempt for 14 yards on the day. Bijan Robinson led the team in rushing with 103 yards and a touchdown. Kyle Pitts led the team in receiving with 65 yards, while Drake London came at a close second with 63 yards, but with a touchdown. The Seahawks scored the first 10 points of the game, and once the Seahawks scored the first touchdown, the Falcons were able to score a touchdown of their own to make it 10-7. But on the final drive of the first half, the Seahawks scored a touchdown to take a 17-7 lead over the Falcons heading into halftime. Both teams scored touchdowns on the first drive of the second half as the Seahawks led 24-14. The Seahawks then had a fumble touchdown in which they pushed their lead up to 31-14, and to cap the game off, they scored a final field goal to give us the final score of 34-14. The next game of the week was a divisional matchup in the AFC North between the Cleveland Browns and the Cincinnati Bengals. The Bengals beat the Browns 21-14 as the Bengals are now 3-4, while the Browns fall to 1-6. Deshaun Watson had an Achilles injury on this day and will likely be out for the season. Joe Burrow went 15 for 25 with 181 yards and two touchdowns. Chase Brown led the team in rushing with 44 yards, while T. Higgins led the team in receiving with 82 yards and a touchdown. Jamar Chase also had a touchdown on the day as well. Deshaun Watson went 15 for 17 and 128 yards before getting hurt, while Dorian Thompson-Robinson took over, went 11 for 24 with 82 yards and two interceptions, and he was benched in favor of Jameis Winston, who went 5 for 11 with 67 yards and a touchdown. Dorian Thompson-Robinson led the team in rushing with 44 yards, while Nick Chubb had 22 yards and a touchdown on the day. Cedric Tillman led the team in receiving with 81 yards, while David Njoku had 76 yards and a touchdown on the day. The Bengals scored a touchdown right off the gate, taking a 7-0 lead over the Browns. It wasn't until the end of the second quarter that the Browns were able to get into the end zone, but they would miss the extra point, and the Bengals took a 7-6 lead over the Browns heading into halftime. On the first drive of the second half, The Bengals scored a touchdown to give themselves a 14-6 lead, in which they scored a touchdown later on as well to make it 21-6. On the final drive for the Browns, they scored a touchdown to give us the final score of 21-14. The next game of the week was between the Miami Dolphins and the Indianapolis Colts, in which the Colts beat the Dolphins 16-10. The Dolphins fall to 2-4, while the Colts are now 4-3. Tyler Huntley started the game as he went 7 for 13 with a touchdown, and then Tim Boyle took over, going 8 for 13 with 74 yards. Devon Achane led the team in rushing with 77 yards, and Jonnu Smith led the team in receiving with 96 yards and a touchdown on the day. Anthony Richardson went 10 for 24 with 129 yards, while he also led the team in rushing with 56 yards. Tyler Goodson had a rushing touchdown on the day, while Michael Pittman Jr. led the team in receiving with 63 yards on the day. The Dolphins scored the first 10 points of the game, and on the final drive of the first half, the Colts got onto the scoreboard as the Dolphins led 10-3 heading into halftime. In the third quarter, the Colts scored a touchdown to tie it up at 10 apiece, and in the fourth quarter, they scored a field goal and then another field goal on 2 consecutive drives to give us the final score of 16-10. The next game of the week was between the Washington Commanders and the Carolina Panthers, in which the Commanders beat the Panthers 40-7. The Commanders are 5-2, while the Panthers fall to 1-6. Andy Dalton went 11 for 16 for 93 yards and had 2 interceptions on the day. Bryce Young went 2 for 2 and had -4 yards on the play, while Chuba Hubbard led the team in rushing with 52 yards and a touchdown. Jatavian Sanders led the team in receiving with 61 yards on the day. Marcus Mariota played for the injured Jaden Daniels and went 18 for 23 with 205 yards and 2 touchdowns. Brian Robinson Jr. led the team in rushing with 71 yards and a touchdown on the day. Terry McLaurin led the team in receiving with 98 yards, while Zach Ertz and Ben Sinnott both had a touchdown each. The Commanders started off the game hot as they had a pick six and scored a field goal on the next drive to give themselves a 10-point lead over the Panthers, and then in the second quarter, they scored a touchdown field goal and a touchdown as they headed into halftime with a 27-0 lead over the Panthers. And on the first drive of the second half, they scored a touchdown followed up by a field goal. And the only points of the game for the Panthers happened in the early fourth quarter, and the Commanders capped it off with another field goal to give us the final score of 40-7. The next game of the week was a rematch of last year's Super Bowl between the Kansas City Chiefs and the San Francisco 49ers. The Chiefs beat the Niners 28-18 as the Chiefs are undefeated and the 49ers fall to 3-4. Both Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel were hurt on the day, so the best receiver that the Niners had was Ricky Pearsall, who had an incident about a couple weeks or a month ago. And Patrick Mahomes went 16 for 27 with 154 yards and 2 picks on the day. Kareem Hunt led the team in rushing with 78 yards and 2 touchdowns. Both Patrick Mahomes and Mecole Hardman had a touchdown on the ground. Noah Gray led the team in receiving with 66 yards on the day. Brock Purdy went 17 for 31 with 212 yards and 3 interceptions. Jordan Mason led the team in rushing with 58 yards, while Brock Purdy had 2 rushing touchdowns on the day. George Kittle led the team in receiving with 92 yards on the day. The 49ers scored the first points of the game with a field goal, which was quickly followed up by 2 Chiefs touchdowns. as they took a 14-3 lead on the final drive of the first half. The 49ers made it a one-possession game, making it 14-6 on the day. On the first drive of the second half, the 49ers scored a touchdown but failed the two-point conversion, which made the score 14-12. And in the fourth quarter, the Chiefs scored a touchdown to take a 21-12 lead over the 49ers, which was capped off by another touchdown on the next drive. And on the final drive for the 49ers, they scored a touchdown, which gave us our final score of 28-18, with the Chiefs winning once again. The next game of the week was Sunday Night Football between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the New York Jets. The Steelers beat the Jets 37-15. The Steelers go up to 5-2, while the Jets fall to 2-5. Aaron Rodgers went 24 for 39 with 276 yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 interceptions. Breece Hall led the team in rushing with 38 yards and a touchdown. He also led the team in receiving with 103 yards, while Tyler Conklin had a touchdown on the day. Russell Wilson got his first start of the year, going 16 for 29 for 264 yards and 2 touchdowns. Najee Harris led the team in rushing with 102 yards and a touchdown. Russell Wilson also had a touchdown on the ground. George Pickens led the team in receiving with 111 yards and a touchdown, while Van Jefferson had a touchdown receiving as well on the day. The Steelers led off the scoring with a field goal on the first drive, which was followed up by a Jets touchdown, which made the score 7-3. The Steelers then scored a field goal to make it 7-6, and on the next drive, the Jets scored a touchdown to make the score 15-6. And on the final drive of the first half, the Steelers scored a touchdown to make it 15-3, heading into halftime. On the first drive of the second half, the Steelers scored a field goal to take a 16-15 lead. The Jets failed to score in the second half, and the Steelers gave us the final score of 37-15. One of two Monday Night Football games was between the Los Angeles Chargers and the Arizona Cardinals. The Cardinals defeat the Chargers 17-15. While the Cardinals are 3-4, the Chargers fall to 3-3. Justin Herbert went 27 for 39 with 349 yards on the day, and J.K. Dobbins led the team in rushing with 40 yards on the day. Will Dissly led the team in receiving with 81 yards, and the Chargers failed to score a touchdown on the day. Cameron Dicker scored 5 field goals on the day. Kyler Murray went 14 for 26 with 145 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. James Conner led the team in rushing with 101 yards, while Kyler Murray had 64 yards on the ground and a touchdown. James Conner also led the team in receiving with 51 yards, tied with Trey McBride on the day. The Chargers scored the first points of the game with a field goal, which was then quickly followed up with a Cardinals touchdown on the next drive. On the final drive of the first half, the Chargers scored a field goal as the Arizona Cardinals took a 7-6 lead over the Chargers at the end of the first half. The Chargers then started the scoring in the second half on their second drive with a field goal, which was followed up by a second Cardinal touchdown and then another field goal by the Chargers. And on the final drives for each team, they scored a field goal, with the Cardinals kicking a game-winning field goal as they won 17-15. The second Monday Night Football of the week was between the Baltimore Ravens and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, in which the Ravens beat the Buccaneers 41-31. The Ravens are now 5-2, while the Buccaneers fall to 4-3. In this game, both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin got hurt, but Chris Godwin has a season-ending injury. Lamar Jackson went 17 for 22 with 281 yards and 5 touchdowns on the day. Derrick Henry led the team in rushing with 169 yards, while Rashad Bateman led the team in receiving with 121 yards. Both Bateman and Justice Hill had a touchdown on the day, while Mark Andrews had 2 touchdowns on the day. Baker Mayfield went 31 for 45 with 370 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Rashad White led the team in rushing with 40 yards, while Bucky Irving scored a touchdown rushing on the day. Cade Otton led the team in receiving with 100 yards, and Rashad White had 2 touchdowns on the day. Mike Evans had 1 on the day as well. Buccaneers scored the first 10 points of the game and then give up 17 unanswered points heading into halftime. The Ravens led the Buccaneers 17-10. And to start off the second half, the Ravens scored on 3 consecutive drives. On the first one, a field goal followed up by 2 touchdowns. This pushed the Ravens' lead to 34-10, and it wasn't until later on in the game that the Buccaneers scored a touchdown, which was then followed up by a Ravens touchdown, which made the score 41-18. However, on the next 2 consecutive drives, the Buccaneers scored touchdowns on both to give us a final respectable score of 41-31. And that recaps all 15 games from Week 7 here in the 2024 to 2025 NFL season. If you like this type of content, like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and I appreciate all the support as we are trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. If you're a fan of the NFL and college football, stay tuned as we'll be covering both all season long. Appreciate all the support, and we'll catch you in the next one. Take care.